How is the situation in the University of York?
It's okay, thanks. Yes, we're still not in the building. Still all working from home, but gradually moving back in September, I think.
Yeah, that's terrible. Yeah, it is something new for my student and to staff to teach online or teach electronically.
Yes, it's a big switch to do everything.
Yeah. So you hope to go back to the building on September?
That's right. Yes. Not for everything, so lectures will still be online.
What about the primary school now at the UK?
Yes, we're told that primary schools will be fully open. At the moment, there are only certain year groups that go back, so not all of them, so they're still quite empty. I'll just put my video on.
Great.
In these situations, I would normally have a paper set of notes to refer to, but everything's on my screen now. So I'm going to be going between different screens and trying to keep it simple.
It's okay. But we wait for more people to join.
Sure.
Dr. Ben, there are someone who wants to join in.
Aha.
Let them in, please.
I can't see any requests for people to join.
Shall we start now or we wait?
I'm happy to start if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll start now. Hello, everyone. It is a great honor for us here at the University of Anbar to host Dr. Ben. He's a great literary figure in the field. It is a great honor, and we are very happy to have him in this Zoom call. Dr. Benjamin Poore is Senior Lecturer in Theatre in the Department of Theatre, Film, Television, and Interactive Media at the University of York, UK. His books include Heritage, Nostalgia, and Modern British Theatre, Staging the Victorians, Theatre and Empire, and Sherlock Holmes from screen to stage. Ben has published widely on literary adaptation for stage and screen, and is currently working on a short book on Robert Icke and Duncan Macmillan's adaptation of George Orwell's 1984. Before we start, I invite my colleagues and students to ask any question if they have any at the end of Ben's talk, and you can write your questions on chat box. Now the word is for you, Dr. Ben, to start.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Majeed. So yes, today my lecture is going to be on this stage adaptation of George Orwell's 1984. And I'm going to do it in a slightly unusual way. I will have my lecture notes on the screen. So sometimes I will go to share screen to show images to you. And for part of the lecture, or for a large part of the lecture, I will be showing my pile of books and very much holding and responding to the physical properties of books, because that's part of the lecture and part of the subject that I'd like to talk about today. Okay. I'm going to share screen for a moment and take you through just my opening slides. So, here's my title. I called it Looking Forward to 1984. It's an adaptation of a classic dystopia. So 1984 has been and gone as a year in my lifetime, but the resonance of the book 1984 has continued, and there are many ways in which it's felt to have been more vital than ever in the last few years. So, my first slide is the opening words of. I'm sorry, I seem to have some noise going on. Is there ability to mute? Great. So the opening words of 1984 by George Orwell are, "It was a bright, cold day in April. The clocks were striking 30." I will come back to that sentence in a few moments. I also just want to show you some of the news headlines that have been important in the UK over the last few months as we have lived through lockdown, because they also connect with 1984. So, here's a headline about when the virus first arrived and lockdown was being considered, and our Prime Minister said many more will lose loved ones to coronavirus. Here is a headline from just a few weeks ago, which is about far-right groups who said they were defending statues when Black Lives Matter movement began to protest the death of George Floyd. And they said that they were defending statues. And so I will come back to that incident as well. Okay, now I'm going to move from that to my own thoughts on this. So I'm just going to move screens. Here we are. So, looking forward to 1984. There are 4 parts to this lecture. And in the first part, I'm going to give a personal reflection on what the ideas and language of 1984 have meant to me as an academic living in the UK in 2020. In part 2, I want to trace the afterlife of 1984, exploring the various ways that it has been applied and interpreted since it was written. In part 3, I move on to adaptation for the theatre and some recent productions that have foregrounded books or have featured elements of bookness. And bookness is a term that has been invented by a theatre and adaptation scholar called Francis Babbage. And finally, in my lecture, I will bring together theatre adaptations and what 1984 means in contemporary culture to offer a way of interpreting the adaptation of 1984 by Robert Icke and Duncan Macmillan. That's the subject of the lecture. So, here's part one. George Orwell's novel, 1984, was first published in the summer of 1949, 71 years ago. And as we saw, it begins with the sentence, "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Here in the United Kingdom, those words have continued to resonate in our present political situation. We've been under lockdown conditions since the middle of March in response to the coronavirus pandemic, a situation we're emerging from gradually as shops, businesses, restaurants, and cinemas reopen. Under lockdown, our days have become blurred. Many of us have reported losing our sense of time as we've been unable to go to work, and as we've been with our children for 24 hours a day, and work that can be done from home can't be adequately separated from domestic life. Like 1984 and its telescreens, the political atmosphere has been all-consuming and reached into every corner of our private lives. There were daily news briefings in which leading government scientists were paraded in front of the cameras to confirm that the government was doing the right thing, the responsible thing, the only thing to be done in these circumstances. And many of us focused our daily routines around those briefings. Only in the last 2 or 3 weeks does it feel like April has finally stopped happening over and over again. And it now very much feels like summer in the UK. So, every age interprets 1984 in its own image. As the adaptation that I'll be discussing later in this lecture makes clear, 1984 is like looking in a mirror. Several aspects of the UK's lockdown have been discussed as distinctly Orwellian, and I want to open my lecture by highlighting some of these. In doing so, I hope to show why 1984 has been occupying my imagination during the last few months. To begin with, we in the UK were told that coronavirus was a very low risk, that it only affected people with pre-existing conditions, and that life could pretty much carry on as normal. Despite the rapidly worsening conditions in Italy, one of our European near neighbours, which was in lockdown, we were still informed by our government that there was nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. Our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, made a speech to business leaders in which he argued for the advantages to economic competitiveness of staying open while the rest of the world was shutting down. There was talk of achieving herd immunity to COVID-19 by at least 60% of the population being infected. As the government moved to contain the virus, Johnson's words seemed to indicate that a high death rate would be inevitable. And he said something very stark on television. "It is going to spread further," I quote, "and I must level with you. I must level with the British public. Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time." Yet, within weeks of lockdown being announced, government sources were denying that there had ever been a herd immunity strategy, and the government messaging had been stripped back to a simple 3-part order: stay at home, protect the NHS, that's our National Health Service, save lives. So the government's flat denial of mistakes and its manipulation of statistics were widely seen by commentators in the media as Orwellian. Orwell, for us, was our go-to comparison for when things are out of kilter and something politically sounds off. the clocks are striking 13 again. Later in the lockdown period, a newspaper investigation revealed that the Prime Minister's most senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, had broken the emergency lockdown laws, driving with his family in a car for over 200 miles from London to his parents' home in County Durham in search of childcare when he and his wife already had symptoms of the virus. Cummings refused to apologise, and the Prime Minister refused to fire him, despite two senior medical officers having resigned when it was discovered that they had broken the lockdown laws. Instead, it was widely noted that Cummings had changed his account of his activities to enable him to explain away incriminating witness statements, and that he had even retrospectively altered his personal blog to make it look as if he had predicted coronavirus last year. There's a musician and satirist in the UK called Boothby Graffo who made a song up in response to the Cummings scandal. And some of the words from that were, "We make the law, we break the law, you didn't see what you just saw." This government's requirement that we deny the evidence of our eyes and ears, again, is British culture's go-to definition of Orwellian. Big Brother is always right. The words of the three slogans of the party in 1984 are, of course, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Meanwhile, those government advisors who had had to resign, unlike Cummings, were written out of the narrative. Like Comrade Ogilvy in George Orwell's novel, public figures could be made up, given prominence, and then disappeared at will. But the atmosphere of 1984 was not to be found exclusively in the British government's dealings with its people. Another dimension of the novel that some observers found unnerving was the willingness of citizens to assume the worst of each other and to act as informants on their neighbours and anyone perceived to be breaking the rules. And that's echoed in the novel 1984 by Parsons being betrayed by his own daughter. It became a weekly tradition at 8 o'clock every Thursday in the UK over the last few months for everyone in the country to stand on their doorsteps and applaud the National Health Service, which it was feared would become overwhelmed by coronavirus cases. In many instances, neighbours judged other neighbours who did not come out to clap. What was wrong with them? Did they not love the NHS enough? Were they traitors to the health service? Others on social media pointed out that a large proportion of those standing on their doorsteps and applauding the NHS were people who had voted the present government into power. And this is a government that over the last 10 years, under 3 different prime ministers, has consistently defunded and privatised the health service. For those on the left, this was a prime example of what Orwell calls doublethink, the ability to simultaneously believe 2 contradictory things. Finally, I want to highlight an aspect of British culture that overlaps with the coronavirus reaction, but that is in some ways symptomatic of another British tendency. In the wake of the murder by a police officer of George Floyd in the United States, there were Black Lives Matter protests all over the globe. In the United Kingdom, a statue of Edward Colston, a notorious slave trader, was taken from its plinth in Bristol and thrown into the River Avon. In response, the following weekend, far-right groups organised a counter-protest to supposedly protect historical statues, particularly those of Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister during the Second World War. Yet it was widely reported that these far-right counter-protesters could then be seen making Nazi salutes by the statue in defence of Churchill. This sense of ideology being turned on its head chimes with Orwell's suspicion that objective truth was falling out of the world, and that in the future, history books would simply reflect the prejudices of those in power. So, on to part 2. As the Orwell biographer D.J. Taylor says, by as early as the mid-1950s, the novel 1984 had not only acquired a vast international audience, but, he says, it had metamorphosed into a moral yardstick. I'm quoting him here. One of those rare books by which a political regime, a technological innovation, and sometimes even a solitary human act can be judged and found wanting, unquote. Within 10 years of publication, people who had never read the novel would nevertheless know about ideas like doublethink, Newspeak, and Big Brother. And it's worth noting that in British culture today, we have a television series called Big Brother and a comedy series called Room 101. So we have incorporated this language very much into our popular entertainment. Orwell's biographer Richard Bradford, in a book that was just published a few weeks ago, says there's testimony from a Polish dissident during the Cold War. So this is in the 1950s. And he wrote that 1984, the book, is both difficult to obtain and dangerous to possess in the Soviet bloc. It is known only to certain members of the inner party. And that's fascinating to me because it's as if the novel 1984 has taken on the same status as the book by Goldstein in the novel. It's a secret text that is passed around and that no one can know about. Taylor, going back to his book on 1984, here it is, it's called 1984, the biography. He says that as the actual year 1984 approached in the 20th century, the media became obsessed with whether Orwell's predictions had come true or would come true. And since then, there's been no shortage of comparisons to Orwell's world. Oppressive regimes, such as that in North Korea, have been compared to 1984, as have the intrusive new technologies of closed-circuit television, of Google, of Facebook, of the practices of data harvesting, of online profiling, and Chinese surveillance. In another book on the history of 1984 by Dorian Linsky, which is called The Ministry of Truth, he notices that after 2001, particularly in America, many right-wing commentators would use terms like thought police from Orwell's novel against the left. And when Edward Snowden leaked documents revealing the extent of American security services surveillance of its own citizens and the rest of the world's, Edward Snowden himself justified his actions with reference to Orwell's book. The mix of show business and propaganda that characterizes public life in modern Russia is compared to 1984 by Dorian Linsky in his book. And D.J. Taylor writes that in the weeks following the inauguration of Donald Trump as US president, ushering in an era of fake news and alternative facts, sales of 1984 had risen by an estimated 950% in America. Strangely, Linsky references the same rise in sales figures for 1984 after Trump's election. But he says that sales went up by almost 10,000%. It's almost like the propaganda figures of record growth and economic production in 1984 itself. 950% or 10,000%? I'm not sure who to believe on that one. So my point in collating all these comparisons is that what I was doing in part 1 was not at all original. Ever since the book's publication, readers have sought to apply it to their contemporary situation. The character, Martin, in Stage Adaptation of 1984, says, "You're seeing yourself in it because it's opaque. It's a mirror. Every age sees itself reflected." And that's also true of the novel, 1984. So, I'm now going to move to part 2, where we think about stage adaptations and how they use the book. So, it's a familiar sight from adaptations of works of literature to film that there's often a large leather-bound book that opens and the screen dissolves into the fictional action. I found a classic example of this from a 1930s adaptation of Jane Eyre. This is the trailer to that 1930s film adaptation of Jane Eyre. And I just want to see if I can share it with you in order to show you what I mean. Okay. So back onto share screen. I come back to my PowerPoint, and hopefully this will be something that you can hear. Just go to, I'll just play the first few seconds. If it doesn't want to do it, then we'll just go into the smaller screen version. Here we are. It was fine earlier. Let's just see if it will respond. If not, not to worry. Okay, it doesn't look like it's going to play ball. Something with the settings must have changed. But you can watch that online. That's a YouTube clip of the Orson Welles version of Jane Eyre, in which a woman is sitting in an armchair. She gets up, she goes to a shelf of library books, and
it has always been true, but never more true than it is right now. The pictures you enjoy most are based on the most widely...
I don't know if it's going to play very effectively.
read novels. Recall Grapes of Wrath, Gone with the Wind, How Green Was My Valley, This Above All, Rebecca. Great pictures, all of them. And now 20th Century Fox brings you Jane Eyre, based on the most widely read novel in our language, printed and reprinted 100 times, most recently by the Book of the Month Club. Its immortal lovers are played by the most discussed celebrity in the entertainment world, and the actress who won the Academy Award in Suspicion.
Whatever happens, do not open a door. Either door.
That's great. That's all we need to see of that. So I will just stop that share for a moment. So hopefully that illustrates that that's a widely established trope in film adaptation. The idea that someone might open a book and then the world of the film then dissolves into the book. And it's as if there is no difference between them. So in doing that, the film makes a visual claim that it emerges from the book with no intermediary, with no human intervention. The book contains the film. It's a moving image between hard covers. That's the message it seems to be communicating. So thinking about Frances Babbage's recent book, which is called Adaptation in Contemporary Performance. Frances Babbage identifies something that she calls bookness, the quality of bookness in performance. And bookness, she explains, is the ways in which the materiality and symbolism of books and an adaptation source or precursor text in particular are made to matter on stage. So here's a quote from Frances Babbage. She says she's examining the, quote, the distinctive ways in which books can matter in adaptation practice, as well as how elements of textual materiality can inform performance itself. Attention to the form of books, as well as to their content, can invigorate not just theatrical practice, but also adaptation in theory, since a more layered analysis of books and bookness in adaptation in turn extends understanding of the ways in which different orders of text speak to and with one another. So she's identifying the materiality of books as being something that matters on stage, particularly in recent stage adaptations. And of course, books have a cultural weight as stand-ins for knowledge, for learning, and by extension, for freedom of the mind or of the imagination. And that extends beyond adaptation into our wider culture. There's a particular centuries-old potency in association between books, knowledge, and freedom. And that accounts for the special taboos that we have in Europe about the burning of books after the Nazis' ceremonial burning of what they called degenerate art in the 1930s. And this association is at the heart of a later dystopian novel too, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. In theatre adaptations, we might think of the company Rimini Protocol, who are based in Berlin, who adapted the first volume of Karl Marx's Das Kapital to the stage, and later they adapted Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf for the stage. In both of these productions, the company uses its theatre-making method of bringing on real-life expert witnesses to comment on the book, creating a kind of three-dimensional annotated edition of these famous or infamous books. The practice is explored by Josefina Comparali in her book, which I've got here. In their adaptation of Mein Kampf, the theatre company actually, in their adaptation of Das Kapital, the theatre company actually distributed copies of the book to the audience. And that's another quite literal manifestation of an idea of bookness. I'm just going to share screens again for a minute so that I can show you some images from that production, because I think, or from those productions, both Das Kapital and Mein Kampf, because I think they will really show how much books feature in that. So here we are. If I go to current slide, this is their production of Das Kapital. You can see the books and the bookshelves very prominently featured, and there an expert is speaking directly to the audience. Here's an image from Mein Kampf. Books are being thrown around, passed between people. Somebody's got their head stuck in a book, and the books are at one point torn apart and destroyed. So the physical properties of books, the act of handing over books, of passing around books, is a very important feature of Rimini Protocol's work. And I'm also just going to show you, while we're here, an image of something called GATS, which I will come back to. We'll return to that in a moment. So, just to think about that materiality of books for another moment. There's an adaptation of Jane Eyre for the stage by Polly Teal, which is quite a famous one. It was first staged in 1999. And that play similarly begins with the child Jane opening a book. She's escaping as a child into the imaginative world of books. So that image is center stage. The next play by Polly Teal for the company Shared Experience was an exploration of the lives of the Bronte sisters. And there again, lots of books, a cascade, a snowstorm of manuscript pages is one of the things that features on the stage. A popular trope for the more experimental side of theatre adaptation is when the source text itself is produced on stage. And the company talk about how difficult the novel is to adapt, and they argue about the meaning of the work. So an example of this is the adaptation of Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness by a company called Imitating the Dog, which was a production which toured in 2019. In new plays that are not adaptations, books still hold a comparative imaginative power. A recent play by Morgan Lloyd Malcolm called Emilia tells the life story of Emilia Bassano, who was supposedly Shakespeare's muse and may have been the Dark Lady of the Sonnets. In the London production of that play, bookshelves and the handling of books came to represent accomplishment, knowledge, independence, and agency for Emilia. As Francis Babbage also points out, adaptations for the stage often both expose and conceal in different measures their status as works that have been adapted from books. One thing they conceal much more, I think, is the scripted nature of the adaptation itself. Because stage adaptations of novels are understood to have a primary relationship with the novel, the play script itself becomes almost a surplus text, one that has to be hidden or disavowed. So we can go back to that share screen again and back to that image. This is from Gatz. And this is an adaptation by a company called Elevator Repair Service of The Great Gatsby. You can see that it's set in an office, and it starts and continues right the way through with Scott Shepherd, the actor you can see holding the book, simply reading The Great Gatsby. And the other members of the company do not actually perform The Great Gatsby, but they provide a kind of commentary on it. They physicalize the text without ever being part of a dramatic adaptation, should we say. So let's just return that. So if I explain a bit more about this. Francis Babbage says that Gatz is set in a drab, cluttered office, instantly familiar, yet with the nature of its business deliberately unspecific. When his computer fails to boot up, an employee picks up a copy of The Great Gatsby found in his desk, and as if for want of anything better to do, begins to read it aloud and does not stop. So here, the adaptation as playtext is cut out altogether. The adaptation consists of an actor reading the novel out loud, and sometimes reciting sections of it from memory. So just to return to that image again, so you've got a sense of Gatz. Yeah, so this is the adaptation of The Great Gatsby, which is simply one person reading the text or having memorized and reciting the text. Okay. So, moving on to part 4. Where does the Duncan Macmillan and Robert Icke adaptation of 1984 sit in relation to this trend of bookness? Well, to begin with, we can note that Orwell's novel, 1984, is one in which the anti-hero, Winston Smith, writes in order to express what we might call his inner truth. So he finds a keepsake book in Charrington's junk shop and begins to write in it in defiance of the party's orders that you can't keep secret diaries. So on one side, there's a private handwritten book in the novel, a journal, which captures Winston's inner truth. But there's another book, as I mentioned earlier, that looms large in the novel, Emmanuel Goldstein's book, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, which is supposed to tell the truth about Ingsoc, English society, and to explain the reality behind the propaganda. So the novel 1984, we might say, is bookended by 2 books, Winston's handwritten book and Goldstein's book that explains how society really works. At this point, I want to provide some background on the stage adaptation of 1984 that I'm talking about. So, this is quite a famous adaptation, and it had a long stage life. It was first staged in September 2013 in Nottingham. It toured the UK and then opened at the Almeida Theatre in London. The play then transferred to the London West End, opening at the Playhouse Theatre in April 2014. After a second national tour in the autumn of 2014, it returned to the West End before a national and international tour. It toured to Santa Monica, Boston, and Washington in the United States in 2016, and came back to London's West End in 2016. After Donald Trump's election as US president, 1984 transferred to Broadway in early 2017. The production was by the theatre company Headlong, and it was adapted by the playwright Duncan Macmillan and the director Robert Icke in a creative collaboration. Dorian Lynskey's book, The Ministry of Truth, back to this one, gives an account of what Macmillan and Icke had to say about the production. And Lynskey explains in his section on the play, a totalitarian regime like Ingsoc is itself a kind of theatre with a script, assigned notes, sets, props, and cues for applause. However, as Robert Icke explained in an interview in the book with Lynskey, Icke said, when thinking about the adaptation, quote, I remember saying, we don't want a guy with blue overalls walking along with a big poster because it's so familiar that it doesn't speak anymore, unquote. Instead, Icke and Macmillan looked for what they called a backdoor key, a new way into understanding the text, a new perspective. They called what they discovered Appendix Theory. So that's a way of looking at the book from the perspective of the appendix at the end of the book. So just to say, the appendix at the end of 1984 simply looks like this. The Principles of Newspeak. That's what it's called. And it's only 13 pages long. But George Orwell always believed it was essential to the meaning of the novel. As its title suggests, The Principles of Newspeak is a supposedly factual document explaining how the grammar and vocabulary of the official language of Ingsoc in 1984, Newspeak, how that language worked. Yet, it was written sometime in the future, after 1984 and after the party had been destroyed. Icke and Macmillan explain in their foreword to the play script, the appendix is fiction pretending to be fact. Written in a period long after the novel's 1984, a time in which the party appears to have fallen, it reconsiders the text that precedes it. So Icke and Macmillan have noticed how the appendix makes us think again about the story that we've just read and what was actually happening there. Icke and Macmillan point out that the appendix, the Principles of Newspeak, is not actually written in Newspeak, but in our version of English, which we can understand, which in 1984, in the novel, they call Old Speak. It's written in Old Speak. The appendix refers to Shakespeare, Milton, Swift, and Dickens, and quotes at length from the American Declaration of Independence. So we imagine it must have been written at a time when these texts were known and uncensored once again, when of course all of that literature and all of that writing in 1984 was banned. But in the story of 1984, Winston is told by his interrogator O'Brien that he will be lifted clean out of the streams of history. But here he is in the appendix, being referred to by name. How has this account of Winston Smith survived? Duncan Macmillan and Robert Icke say, we don't know quite whether to trust it. They don't know whether to trust the appendix. Going back to Dorian Lynskey, Lynskey explains, appendix theory turns the rest of the book into a historical document that has been studied and edited by persons unknown. Once entered by that route, says Lynskey, the novel becomes an unnerving maze of riddles, paradoxes, and mysteries. In the words of Duncan Macmillan, quote, everything is both true and false at the same time, unquote. It's doublethink as a structural device, is another thing he says. The play leaves the puzzle and the truth status of the story of 1984 deliberately unsolved. I can Macmillan say that according to George's estate, which controls the copyright on 1984, theirs is the first adaptation in any form to dramatise the appendix. When I read about the production, I got very excited and thought that Ike and Macmillan had only dramatised the appendix. So I imagined that they might have ignored all the rest of the novel and just dramatised those 13 pages. That really would have been a radical interpretation. As it is, their adaptation does tell the story of Winston and Julia and O'Brien, but it tells the story in fits and starts. The play is writing in his secret book, but within a few minutes, the host, a gentle, benevolent man in his 60s, is revealed. It turns out to be a plot, but the hosts, and it seems to be in the present day. And that throws the authenticity of Winston's diary into question. Later, we learn that O'Brien and his collaborators actually wrote Goldstein's book themselves. Goldstein's book is a fiction. It's a trap for people like Winston who think that they can revolt. A mother, a father, and the child at some other point in time drift in and out of the play's action. At the end of the play, they question the host on the status of the story of Winston Smith, and the mother reflects, how do we know the party fell? Wouldn't it be in their interest to just structure the world in such a way that we believe that they were no longer? And the stage direction then says, she loses her train of thought. In this way, any faith that we have had in the truth value of the 3 books that feature in 1984 is destroyed. In that sense, it's very much a version for our times, as we're left unsure whether objective truth will at any point make a comeback in politics. And like the character Mother in the play, many of us in the UK are too distracted to piece these inconsistencies together. We lose our train of thought. As Orwell said at the end of his life in a statement dictated to his publisher, Fred Warburg, quote, the moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you. At this point, I just want to show you some images of 1984. Let me get that share screen up again so that you can picture the way in which it was staged in this production. Here we go. So that's Gats. This is the Ike and Macmillan adaptation of 1984. As you can see, there are books, there are boxes, there are files on stage as well. Some paper flying about. And here's Winston Smith keeping his secret band journal. So that's an indication of the visual style, shall we say, of 1984 in that adaptation. So thinking about what Dorian Lynskey outlines, in the way that 1984, the adaptation, had a publicity campaign that took place when the play was being staged in theatres. So when it originally opened in Nottingham in 2013, the theatre company Headlong had an app designed which was called Digital Double, and that was projected onto the wall of the theatre foyer images and messages from the phones that belonged to members of the audience. Now, those audience members had signed their rights away to allow this to happen under the terms and conditions of the app. Now, the audience was supposed to be horrified by this, by the misuse of their data that they had given away, and would think twice in future about their online behavior. But in actual fact, what happened, to the surprise of the designers of the app, was that audience members were delighted by this new way to share their screens. So that was an app that was designed at the play's opening, to coincide with the play's opening in 2013. When the play opened on Broadway, and remember this was just after President Trump's inauguration in 2017, a quotation from 1984 was shared on social media and it quickly went viral. This is all explained in Minsky's book. The quotation was, quote, "The people are not going to revolt. They will not look up from their screens long enough to notice what's really happening," unquote. The quotation was, of course, a fake. It was written by Ike and Macmillan, not by George Orwell. In the age of fake news and alternative facts, Ike and Macmillan's 1984 adaptation joined the chaos of unreliable information rather than staking a claim for objective truth. So, let's think about how this adaptation connects with the stage adaptations I talked about earlier. Gats, Das Kapital, Mein Kampf, Jane Eyre, and the preoccupation of all of those productions with bookness, with the materiality of books. Well, as we've seen, the adaptation introduces us to the idea that what we're seeing can't be trusted, and that what we're reading can't be trusted either, whether we're reading the play script of 1984 or whether we're reading in the theatre the text that is projected onto the screen in the theatre watching the production. This demand, this injunction that we should not trust books is a bold claim, since, as we've seen, the rhetoric of stage adaptations and other theatre sometimes too has been to say, trust books, they're good for you. Trust the source text because it's a good book, it's a classic. Theatre usually says, trust the theatre company because they've laboured and struggled to make this adaptation and to be true, whatever that means, to the source. Theatre adaptations traditionally say, trust that this is happening live, that this is unscripted, it's happening in the moment. Trust that we're not being watched. By contrast, the headlong adaptation by Ike and Macmillan tells us, you can place your trust in a book, but the book will betray you. Their production of 1984 says that you might have the faith in the idea of a single true author of a book, but that's not true either. The adaptation says you might believe that things are really happening now, but they could just as easily be a recreation, a reenactment from the past. In the play, at one point, Winston speaks directly to the audience, pleading with them. How can you just sit there? Get up, do something, help me, help me. You have to stop them. Please get up, please. I'm sorry. But at the end of the play, Father, the character Father, asks, but Winston was imaginary? And the host replies, never existed. So that's another case of you didn't see what you just saw. If I can come back to that second bullet point, that second idea, the idea of a single true author of a book being challenged by the adaptation. So Goldstein's book was written by many different hands, it turns out, in 1984. Winston, the writer of the diary, may never have existed. Even George Orwell might not be a single true author, in at least two senses. Firstly, adaptation theory tells us that no text is completely original, and Orwell's 1984 is an adaptation in the sense that it clearly responds to a whole line of dystopian fiction, from Jack London's The Iron Heel, published in 1908, to H.G. Wells' When the Sleeper Wakes, published in 1907, to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, published in 1932. And this is something D.J. Taylor explained in his book on 1984. In a second way, we can think about George Orwell as also adapting his own previous work, his own essays and novels, which were concerned with both totalitarianism and a peculiar kind of domestic tyranny. So, on the subject of questioning the singleness and the originality of the author, I think it's also significant that this adaptation that I've been talking about today is presented to us as a new adaptation created by playwright and director Duncan Macmillan and Robert Icke. It's a playwright and director team. So authorship and ownership are further blurred at the level of the play script's publication and its authorship credits. So to conclude, D.J. Taylor, going back to his book, 1984, A Biography, D.J. Taylor writes about the novel's eerie, hallucinatory atmosphere. And I think something of that atmosphere is captured in the adaptation that we've been discussing and the way it plays with time and perspective. Indeed, eerie, hallucinatory atmosphere could also describe the experience of living under lockdown that I mentioned right at the start of the lecture. In the torture scene, the stage directions in the adaptation say that the room is somehow endless. So that's another example of playing with time and perspective. Dorian Lynskey, in his book, The Ministry of Truth, notices that the word Orwellian has two opposing definitions. Here I'm quoting him. It's either work that reflects Orwell's style and values, or real-world developments that threaten them. And the fact that Orwellian can mean two contradictory things seems apt for an adaptation that is both true and not true, an adaptation that turns the perspective of the novel upside down. And actually, in the introduction of the published script, it calls the introduction forward appendix. The adaptation is Orwellian in both senses. So, Macmillan and Icke's adaptation of 1984 anticipates what was to come in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, for instance, way back in 2013 when it's first staged. And that's a comparable degree of prediction to how Orwell somehow anticipated how the Soviet bloc countries in the Cold War would be in the novel, despite never having visited them. Macmillan and Icke's adaptation also calls into question, as this lecture has argued, stage adaptation's love affair with the idea of the book, of bookness. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this enjoyable and stimulating lecture. We really enjoy it. And to be honest, your lecture gives us a hope that coronavirus will disappear soon, especially in the first part of your lecture. Yeah. As we know that George Orwell's 1984 as a novel holds a particular position in our cultural collective subconscious. Some of its terminologies are still in our mind, such as Big Brother, Newspeak, and Room 101. Yes.
Really?
Yeah. Now it is time for questions. I start the question with mine. I only wonder about adaptation, the issue of adaptation. As we know, the adaptation means the transformation of the original text to suit the modes of the receptions for the modern audience. The ultimate phase of the narrative work may totally displace the original in the minds of the audience. This process, which is so-called adaptation displacement, is not always successful. It depends actually on the cultural, aesthetic, ideological, and theoretical factors. My question is, what are the challenges confronted by Robert and Duncan when they make the novel as a theatrical one? I read some review. I read a review for the play by Kate Hansi. She said She entitled her essay, 1948 review, stage adaptation confuses our world's classics. And she enumerates 3 challenges. The first one is how to stage Oceania. The second one, how to externalize Winston's thought crimes, and also the relationship between Winston and Julia. So what are the challenges confronted by them to make it as a theatrical piece?
Great, thank you. Great multi-layered question there. I'll try and approach it by a few angles. So yes, as I mentioned in the lecture, they really experienced that challenge. How can we find a way into 1984 that isn't, or that hasn't already been done? And so that idea of displacement, I think, is much more likely to happen with film, where a film can become much better known than the novel or whatever it's based on, and have a much, because of its star power, because of its global reach, it can have a much larger cultural imprint. What Icke and Macmillan were struggling with when they were thinking about adapting 1984 was that had already been done for 1984, particularly by the film adaptation that was released in 1984, a British film that starred John Hurt as Winston Smith. So when they talk about a man in a blue boiler suit walking past a poster of Big Brother, what they're thinking of is, this has already been done in film. How do we do it differently? How do we get away from that? Because that seems to have dominated our imagination of what 1984 is like. So I think with theatre, it's possibly the opposite issue, that unless a theatre production is very, very exceptional, most of them run for a few weeks and then are forgotten. So there was another adaptation of 1984 by Matthew Dunster that was staged at around the same time, 2012, 2013, and that hasn't been nearly as remembered. So often stage adaptations get forgotten and new ones get written every time, and they don't stick in the cultural memory as much as films or perhaps TV shows do that adapt. So it's getting those things to stick. I think theatre can capture some elements of the workings of the mind through kind of staging that opens up a book's thought processes and what goes on in the mind of a book, what goes on in the world of a book, in ways that are anti-realistic and can do that more effectively than film, where the assumption is of a degree of kind of realist representation. And films that depart from that are relatively unusual. So I think what theatre can do is, with a novel like 1984, is to explore its strangeness, to explore the things about it that are unreal, that are nightmarish, because so often it is understood and read and filmed as being a realistic story, as being something in the realist tradition. So I think that's what theatre brings, and that's the challenge.
Great. The second question, to give a chance for my colleagues to ask. When I read 1984, I only wonder about the importance of appendixes. Are these written later, not in 1949? Because we see the most important sentences are in the appendixes. For example, we at the end, in the ending of the novel, we see this quotation. If you, this is for Winston. If you want a picture of the future, Winston has been told, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
So, which is such a famous line from the play, from the novel, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, that is one of the mysteries of 1984, that the appendix clearly meant so much to George Orwell, and yet it is not really the story. It's something that throws the whole story into question. So if Orwell was trying to write something that would be read as truthful, to then create something right at the end that suggests, but is this really true? Did this really happen? Who's telling us this story? How has this story reached us from the future? It's a strange thing to do. It's both a doing and an undoing. And the thing that it reminds me a lot of is the way that George Bernard Shaw, with the play Pygmalion, tries to close off the meaning of the end of the play. He was very angry that people interpreted it as a love story and tried to give it a happy ending. He said that he'd written a very unromantic ending for it, but that productions kept on presenting it as romance. So what he tried to do in order to stop this was to rewrite the ending of the play several times. And finally, he produced what he called a postscript, which was simply a prose account of what happened to the characters after the play had ended, to force people not to treat it as romance. The trouble with doing that is that every time he tried to close down meaning, new meanings proliferated. And I think it's a similar problem with Orwell's Appendix, that somehow, accidentally on purpose, he is throwing into question the truth value of everything with what appears at the end. So I think it's fascinating, and I think it's amazing that Eyre and Macmillan have highlighted that.
Great. Dr. Ahmed, if you have any question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Dr. Ahmed.
Yeah, hi for all. Thank you very much, Professor Poore, for your informative and marvelous academic presentation. My question is, to what extent adaptation can reflect the intention of the original text, I mean the novel itself? Because I do believe it is different to write down something for the sake of novel, not like that for the sake of to be a type of performance on a stage. So I think there is a difference. Is it there, or it makes no difference between?
I think it's very different. I think the act of performing something raises all sorts of questions that novels themselves can't anticipate. Novels tend to be interior things that trace consciousness. You're often inside a character's head, and when something is adapted on stage, you have these bodies that have to appear in 3 dimensions, and you have to decide as a director what to do with those bodies, and that creates meanings that are difficult to keep completely in line with a novel's intentions, even supposing that that's exactly what's wanted. Have I?
Okay, one second, sorry. So will the original text be affected?
Will the original text be affected by the adaptation? I think people will understand it differently for a few years, but I think the larger history of 1984 and its afterlife since it was published tells us that in a few years' time, people will see something different in 1984 again, and they'll say, oh, no, we thought it was all about fake news. We thought it was all about never being able to know what's true and what's not. It's not about that, it's about this instead. So every few years, our concerns change, and the novel seems to morph and change to reflect that. So I really do agree with the idea that it's a mirror, and that we see ourselves reflected in it. And as our concerns change, that novel changes. Despite it being the same text, it seems to us different every time we go back to it.
Right. So if the text of the novel, 1984, is there in the mind of the reader, will the audience as readers will accept the new performance, or shall they have sort of debate from inside towards what's going on in front of them?
I think it will have it received different interpretations and different degrees of praise, depending on whether people liked the idea that they taken the text apart and questioned it. I'm sure some would prefer to see a much more straight adaptation that reproduced the main part of the novel. But one of the things that Ike and Macmillan noticed on the sort of the social media discussion of the play afterwards when it was on Broadway is that no one could agree what it was actually about, their version. Everybody had a theory as to what was true, what was false, what was real, what wasn't, but nobody could pin it down. So they had created this unsolvable mystery. Some people like that, and some people find that they'd much rather stick with the truth value of the novel. But it's the appendix that really opens up that question.
Right, right. Actually, my question depends on an idea that adaptation usually and naturally comes like this from a novel to be a film. And sometimes I find certain examples, certain novels, for example, certain plays, for example, Romeo and Juliet of Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
It is adapted by an Iraqi playwright, the same topic that the play has, Romeo and Juliet, but in Baghdad, and he depends on the plot that presented by Shakespeare, but with a little bit of flavor here and there, with just of type of setting of Iraqi setting, just to be accepted for the audience.
Mm.
But the reaction was really great for certain critics and those who are interested in a play or in Shakespeare's play in general, that the text of Shakespeare prepared the mind to accept the new adapted text. But for this text from novel to be adapted and to be presented as a performed action as a play, I think it needs a lot of let's say ability, capacity of a professional playwright just to be acted like this and to be accepted as far as the original text is concerned. I highly appreciate being with you, sir, and I got the benefit of this. Hope to meet you again. Just to give turn to my colleagues if there are a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Sohair, if you please. Dr. Sohair.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Majeed. Hello, Professor Benjamin. Glad to hear from you. It is a very interesting lecture. My question is not really about the performance on the stage, but about the theory of adaptation. Can we get the theory or take the theory of adaptation with appropriation and intertextuality to make or to apply them for a certain text, to have this, according to Linda, the theorist of adaptation, that she confirms that adaptation is the process of creation and the product of reinterpretation. It is a type of repetition. How do we consider or confirm about her theory with intertextuality and appropriation to, I think we have a text or a volume of poetry by Mohja Qahf, a very famous Arab-American poet. She takes certain stories from the Holy Quran, narratives, and make them in a new way of poetry that she depends really upon adaptation, appropriation, and intertextuality. Thank you, sir.
Yes, so I think you're referring to Linda Hutchins' theory of adaptation, and I think that's a fascinating book. I tend to disagree on one of her principles, which is that it's about the story, that it's the story that travels. I don't think it's always the story that travels. So in my book on Sherlock Holmes, I suggest that the story is actually the least important part of the idea of Holmes and Watson, and that it's the characters who transfer rather than any particular narrative. And I wonder if maybe that idea can be applied to the stage adaptation of 1984 as well, because it adapts an atmosphere from the novel. It doesn't necessarily adapt what the novel tells us in a linear way. And so that idea of repetition that you mentioned is particularly important, I think, to this adaptation, because it's an adaptation that not only repeats because it's an adaptation, but it then repeats itself within that adaptation. We are going round in circles. We're having the story framed and reframed for us. People are drifting in and out of the story. And so there's this repetitive circular quality that seems to be almost as if the play is adapting itself as it's being staged again. It's adaptation on adaptation. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Great. Yes, Huda Abd, you want to say something?
Hello, Prof.
Hello.
I'm Assistant Professor Huda Abd Ali from Baghdad University, head of TOEFL Center. And really, Doctor, in this occasion, we could say that no one can deny the contribution of media in spreading a certain concept, just like dystopia, okay? And in reflecting such issues, which I think that you are connecting in this presentation, Prof, you are connecting centuries together, because what happened in the past, I think it's really repeated nowadays, and many societies are suffering from injustice, poverty, and many, let us say, ill diagnosis of sufferings. But what happened in media is just a reflection of what have been written as literary text, okay? So they are in fact increasing the knowledge and the awareness of people of what happened. Just like when you are presenting for us the treasure of the very perfect text, just like one of them, Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, and the other books. I like the way that you are presenting things, but my question is that, Doctor, okay, we now know the problems that societies are suffering from, and they are typical for most, but what kind of solutions such media or literary texts could provide the young people with in order to give an end for the sacrifice and to give a solution for societies to live in peace? Doctor.
Yes, I mean, goodness, that's a big question. And I think one of the things about media that this adaptation seems to have brought to the fore, particularly with the app that I described in the first stage production, Digital Double, it's the fact that in 1984, the novel, George Orwell imagined a world in which screens oppressed us, screens watched us, and we were oppressed by that. What's kind of difficult about the 21st century is that it didn't work out that way, in that people willingly give their data, their privacy, and their attention to screens in which they feel empowered. They don't feel that oppression nearly so much as Orwell imagined. So how do we legislate for a world in which people are perhaps giving their power away, or willingly absorbing themselves into this this digital world? And you know, I suppose I would have said a few months ago, we have to get away from the digital. We have to trust the evidence of our own ears and eyes, as Orwell said, and let's digital detox. But what's made things so complicated over the last few months is how much we've relied on that digital technology, how much we've relied on media to maintain a sense of humanity. So where the narrative around digital media, for instance, had been about its kind of toxic and dehumanizing and fake news qualities for the previous years, now there's a lot more sort of positive interpretation of what we've been able to do and what we've been able to hold on to in lockdown by digital means. And it makes me wonder if, this pandemic had happened in the year 1984, our historic year 1984, before the internet had existed. How would we have managed? How would life have been if we hadn't been able to meet and connect in a non-physical realm? So that's really shifted our understanding of media, I think, a lot, because our lives have been so affected by this. So yeah, it's really complicated because Orwell didn't anticipate either the pandemic or that willing participation in digital life.
I totally do agree with you, Doctor, and really it's a very challenging task to be adapted. Congratulations for choosing such a topic, and really your efforts and Dr. Majeed's efforts are highly appreciated. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, great. Yes, Noor, if you have any question, Noor.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for allowing me to participate. Hi, Prof.
Hi.
I think this is an interesting novel, especially as a warning in order to make people aware that this type of society could exist if trends such as totalitarianism, oppression of the working, and the erosion of language that expresses the expansion of human experiences continued. Also, the specific politics lead to specific social practices which are unavoidable, inescapable, and symptomatic to the nature of these politics. We can summarize the message of this novel in one sentence by Benjamin Franklin: be wary of trading your liberty for your safety. The most attractive matter is the using of the new term, which was used by the writer himself, doublethink. He used them by the three slogans of the party in Oceania: war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. He used doublethink, ironically, to show how the government manipulates people by believing in the idea and its paradox. Like freedom and slavery, you have to be slave in order to be free. It is really a smart way. And it goes directly in the concept of doublethink that Immanuel Goldstein explains through the word black-white. My question is, what are the reflections of the terms doublethink and Newspeak to the regime nowadays? Do you find any similarity?
Are you asking, do I see examples of doublethink and Newspeak in?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, in contemporary society. Oh, absolutely. And the government messaging here in the UK has very much been criticised as a form of doublethink, in that it's deliberately confusing. We're now in a phase where we are told, stay alert, control the virus. Previously our instructions were stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. Those were concrete things we could do. Now we have messages that are asking us to control the virus. We can't do that. That's not within our power. So the ways that language, and there are theories that deliberately vague language is there to confuse us, so that we don't focus our blame on the government. So that's where the discussion of language has got to. I think also your quotation from Benjamin Franklin about trading liberty for security is so relevant to the issues that we're facing with coronavirus, that when the lockdown first began, there was such social solidarity in everyone feeling like this is the right thing to do, this is what we have to do to protect the elderly and the vulnerable. There is no moral debate about this. People could criticize the government, but they felt like what they were fundamentally doing was right. I think a movement like Black Lives Matter has challenged that towards the end of our lockdown period, because it's made us think about, well, what is the trade-off here between liberty and security? If we can't go out and protest because that might break the 2-meter rule, then what kind of citizens are we? What worlds are we living in now? So those questions have really come to the fore as we have thought about, and as we've lived in a lockdown situation for a long time. We've thought about those challenges to freedom and what security might mean and what might be the traps of that.
Definitely, I agree with you, Doctor. I think there is a relevant relationship, but nowadays we can replace the term doublethink with a new term made by me, which is dissimulation. It is a compound word from the word deception, and manipulation, which is done by government. Yeah.
Yes, I like that, dissimulation. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you too, Prof.
Yes, Dr. Ben, have a cup of water, please, because we have questions. Have a cup of water. Dr. Ben, do you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah, Dr. Ben, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Have a cup of water because we have 3 questions, more questions.
Great, no problem.
Yeah. Zahra Al-Khalidi asked the following questions. She said, is there another dystopian play or novel adapted in the same way like 1984?
Oh, not that I have come across. I noticed, Robert Icke has done some work for the Almeida Theatre before, and I think one of the things that he worked on was a play by Anne Washburn called Mr. Burns. And that's maybe the closest thing that I've seen to this adaptation of 1984. Mr. Burns is a play, it's set way in the future in which all our civilization has been destroyed. And the people of the future try to work out what our civilization was, but they only have an episode of The Simpsons, the cartoon, to reconstruct our civilization from. So in the sense of a backdoor key to understanding our civilization, I think the Anne Washburn play, Mr. Burns, is the closest thing that I've seen. It's not an adaptation, but it's a way of looking at the present through the lens of the far future and saying, what evidence do we leave behind? How is the future going to understand how our world worked?
Great. Another question is by Laith, one of my students. He said, in 1984, the play was defeated in front of the novel. How do you comment on this claim?
In 1984, could you repeat that?
The play in 1984 as a play was defeated in front of the novel. How do you comment on this claim?
That 1984 was defeated?
Yeah, he made comparison between 1984 as a novel and as a play.
Oh, I see. And which one defeated which in that?
He said the play was defeated. As a play was defeated.
The play was defeated, so yeah. the novel kind of won.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. That's a really good question. Sorry, I didn't quite understand, but it's a really good way of thinking about it, because often source texts and their adaptations are placed in competition. They're placed in antagonism by reviewers and by viewers who say, oh, well, the novel was better, or the film was better, the play was better. I think Orwell's novel is its position is not in any doubt. It will not fade away, and it will not be threatened or displaced by this adaptation. I think this adaptation will be probably forgotten and a historical curio in a few years' time, just like, you know, David Bowie wrote some songs about 1984 on an album called Diamond Dogs in the 1970s, and that's a real historical curiosity, but it hasn't threatened or displaced the novel. The novel is kind of much bigger and stronger, but it's a kind of David and Goliath thing. It's a kind of mouse versus an elephant, and I rather like the way that the adaptation, as a little mouse running around the elephant's feet, is able to kind of make us think about this titanic novel in a different way. But you know, it will not displace or replace it in our cultural imagination.
Great. We have the last two questions. The first question is from Brahim. He said, is there a big similarity between 1984 and 2020? And if there is a similarity, I mean, in all branches of life, like literature production and political situations?
Gosh, well, certainly you could make an argument that the way that literature is produced in a very sort of mass-produced, pulpish way in the world of 1984, you know, look at any form of media that you don't like, and you will see those kinds of it's just churned out by machine. It's so predictable. You know, any television series that we don't like can be seen to have those elements because it looks like it's been kind of written by machine. I wonder if politically the way in which 1984 has come true has been very different in different parts of the world. And I think perhaps what we've experienced in the UK and the United States in the last few years has been a shock to us because we didn't imagine it could happen here. But it's been happening in other parts of the world for so long that, you know, there was an imagined barrier that was like, but this can't happen to these kind of bastions of liberal democracy. So I think it has come true more than we expected, certainly more than we expected probably in the year 1984, when I was kind of a teenager and thought it won't be like that at all. You know, the world doesn't look like that. I think it looks more like that in 2020 than it did in 1984.
Good. There is another question by Zainab Mahmoud. She is one of my students. This is not a question. She only wondered about the validity of her opinion. She writes here, adaptation with the text of the novels or their reflections depends on the degree of the reader's deepening literary criticism, or at the very least, it depends on his experiences that may come into contact with one thing or another of the novel's events, whether in 1984 or in our time today. Am I right? On the other hand, the way of performance of the novel as a film, for example, is effective too.
So is that a question about, or an idea around levels of literary engagement?
She wants to say that adaptation of the text of the novel or reflection depends on the degree of readers' intellectuality.
Yes, and I think one way to look at this adaptation of 1984 is it's a great piece of literary criticism. It's a way of understanding the novel that I've not read in any kind of scholarly articles about 1984. It's a reading, and certainly that's something that Frances Babbage talks about in her book, that, you know, one way of thinking about adaptations is not that they are kind of thefts or rip-offs or kind of cheap versions of the original, but they are commentaries on them. They are offering a form of kind of live literary criticism that will offer to help us understand better. So in that sense, if somebody had read 1984 and really not seen its subtleties, its contradictions, going to see that stage version might possibly have opened it out for them and made them realize that there's more to it than meets the eye. So adaptation as a form of criticism, I think, is quite a valid idea.
Yes, great. At the end of your talk, we can only say thank you very much for this enjoyable and interesting lecture, especially here at the University of Anbar. We look forward to more cooperation between our university and the University of York. Thank you very much, Dr. Ben.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute delight to have this conversation here in York on what for us is a Friday afternoon. So it's been a great conversation and a great opportunity to share some thinking with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.